The Russian invasion of Ukraine is an event that will shape the future of the entire world. At this time, it is difficult to say how the new world order would look like and how would this be different from the world order that has existed since the end of the Second World War. To get a macro historical perspective on the sweeping changes that are upon us at this moment, I am privileged and delighted to be joined live and exclusive on India Today's news track by the world's greatest living historian, author of the best-selling book Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, which I'm sure he'd now need to revise. Joining us live from Tel Aviv in Israel is the rockstar historian and professor Yuval Noah Harari. Professor Harari, it is an absolute honor to have you back with us on India Today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to start by asking you about a recent column that you wrote where you say that this is not just a war between Russia and Ukraine, this is an event that will shape the whole world. Can you start by giving our audiences who are watching you at this time a sense of why you believe that this is not just a war between Putin and Zelensky, the Russian army and the Ukrainian army, but this is something that impacts everyone the world over?
Yes, because if the Russian aggression succeeds, we will see more and more of this kind of aggression all over the world. You know, since 1945, it became unacceptable for one country to simply invade a weaker nation and obliterate it from the face of the map, which is what Putin is trying to do. If Putin succeeds, you know, there are countries all over the world and tyrants all over the world watching this to see what will happen. If he succeeds, we will see more and more of it, and we will enter a new dark era in history, which everybody will feel. To give just one example, just think about defense budgets. Today in the world, the average military budget of countries is about 6% of government budget, which is the lowest in history. Most governments spend far more on healthcare, education, welfare. In history, this is very rare. Most sultans and emperors and kings, they spent most of their money on their army and almost nothing on healthcare and education and welfare. If Putin succeeds, we will see defense budgets around the whole world skyrocket. We already saw Germany doubling its military budget in a day. And this money will come from healthcare, from education. The money that should go to teachers and doctors will go to tanks and to airplanes. And everybody will feel it. We will also lose the potential to deal with the main problems of humankind, like climate change and like the rise of artificial intelligence. Because how can you reach an agreement on fighting climate change or on limiting artificial intelligence when countries are trying to destroy each other? So this is why this is an existential danger to the whole humankind, what is happening right now.
So you write in The Guardian that a week into the war, it is increasingly likely that Vladimir Putin is heading towards a historic defeat. He may win the battles, but he will lose the war. What makes you so confident that Vladimir Putin is heading towards a historic defeat?
You see, it's easier to conquer a country than to hold it in the long run, as we saw in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in many other places. Now, this whole war is about the very existence of the Ukrainian nation. It's not about conquering this city or that city. And it's all based on a lie, on a fantasy in Putin's head. Putin believes that the Ukrainian nation doesn't really exist. Putin believes that Ukrainians are actually Russians, that they want to join Russia, to be absorbed by Russia, and that the only thing that prevents it is a small gang of so-called Nazis at the top. He therefore believed, and this explains the failure so far that we are seeing, he believed that in 24 hours, the minute the Russian army invades, Zelensky will fly, the Ukrainian army will surrender, and the Ukrainian people will throw flowers on the Russian tanks. And he was completely wrong. Zelensky didn't fly, didn't flee the country. The Ukrainian army is fighting like hell, and the Ukrainian people is throwing Molotov cocktails on the Russian tanks, not flowers. Ukraine is a very real nation fighting for its survival. Yes, Putin may still conquer the country, but he will not be able to absorb it. Every day this war lasts, he is planting seeds of hatred between Ukrainians and Russians, which previously were like family. And this hatred will last for generations unless he stops this war immediately.
You said that to re-establish the Russian Empire, Putin needed a relatively bloodless victory that would lead to a relatively hateless occupation. But by spilling more and more Ukrainian blood, Putin is making sure his dream will never be realized. How do you think the war that we've seen this week is likely to end, Professor Harari?
I don't know. I can't predict the future. It could end right now if Putin gives the order, because this is a war of one person only. This isn't Russia's war. It isn't the war of the Russian people. They don't want it. There is just one person in the whole world that wants this war, and this is Putin, and he can stop it immediately. If he doesn't, it can last for months and years. Again, he can conquer the whole country, but the war will continue for years. He will never be able to actually absorb it. It also depends to a large extent on the reaction of other countries. Countries whether in Europe or whether in Asia, like India. Russia is actually a weak country. People think that Russia is like the Soviet Union. It isn't. It's much, much weaker. It's not one of the 10 largest economies. The Russian economy is actually smaller than the economy of Italy or of South Korea. You know, Russia has a GDP of $1.6 trillion a year. Europe combined has more than 20 trillions. If Europe and the world unite against Russia, Putin cannot prevail. I'll say another thing about it. You know, the whole Russian economy is built just on gas and oil. And it's like a gas station with nukes. If the world unites to, or if even just Europe unites to create a green Manhattan project to replace oil and gas with alternative energy, the Putin regime is finished. When an oil barrel costs $20 instead of $100 like now, this is the end of the Putin regime.
You've made an interesting comparison about Putin casting himself in the role of Hitler. Why do you think that Putin is shaping up to be the 21st century Adolf Hitler?
You see, the way that he's inflicting tremendous suffering on tens of millions of people simply because of his cruel ambition. There is no rationale for this war. As I said, the Russian people doesn't want it. And you know, people talk about the security interests of Russia. Nobody was threatening Russia when this war erupted. If Russia had concerns, they could be discussed peacefully. You know, the Germans were not about to invade, the French were not about to invade. It was his decision. And in this sense, of course there are many differences also between him and Hitler. But in this sense of one person inflicting a terrible war on the whole world, there is a comparison there. And you know, the other main thing, and in this Putin is like many other dictators, not just Hitler, that when he builds this lie in his head, nobody around him is brave enough to confront him. A dictator usually has so much power that the people around him are afraid to contradict him. So even when he says completely ridiculous thing, everybody tells him, yes, 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 you're absolutely right, you're a genius. And this is why he embarked on this war, assuming completely false things, such as that Ukraine is not a nation and that the Ukrainians will not resist.
In the past 7 decades, there hasn't been a direct conflict between the major powers of the world, and no recognized country has had its status changed forever. Do you apprehend that in the way events are shaping up, we could be heading towards a third world war? Is that within the realm of your possibilities?
I hope very much not. I think the West is very cautious about it. And again, remember that Russia, it has nukes, that's true. But apart from that, it's a relatively weak power. It is not the Soviet Union. You know, if other nations join it, like China or like Iran, then it's a completely different matter. But so far we've also seen that China is sitting on the fence, just observing what is happening, not committing itself. Russia by itself is not strong enough to have a third world war. It can destroy humanity with nuclear weapons, that's true. And everybody should be worried about nuclear weapons, because if this war continues, we will see nuclear weapons spreading more and more. You know, Germany and Japan are now thinking about it again, because they say to themselves, in 2024, who knows who the US president will be? Maybe Trump is president again. And if Russia or China invades us in 2024, 2025, are we really certain that Trump will defend us? If not, we need our own nukes. And then Iran says, wait, if Germany and Japan now have nukes, why can't we? And we will see more and more nuclear weapons spreading. And as there are more and more fingers on the button of the nuclear weapons, the chances increase that somebody somewhere will press it, and it will be the end of human civilization.
How do you see the global economy change on account of this war? Past wars were about land, or they were about minerals, resources. Now we're in the Internet of Things. It's about technological prowess, AI, ML. It's not so much about physically occupying land. So how does this change the economic dimension of history, Professor?
Because of the change in the economy, we have indeed seen less wars in recent years. You know, previously in history, if a country or a king wanted to enrich themselves, a way to do it was to conquer the neighbors, because the main source of wealth was wheat fields and rice fields and cattle and slaves that you can conquer by war. Increasingly now, the main sources of wealth are not material. They are knowledge, like the knowledge to produce a high-tech industry. And you can't conquer knowledge by war. And you see that recent countries that became very wealthy, like Germany, like China, like Japan, they didn't do it by war. They did it by developing their society and their economy. Russia is in this sense moving in a very different trajectory. Instead of investing in its people, in education, in healthcare, it's investing in military. I said earlier that military budgets around the world today are on average about 5 or 6%. In Russia, it is 11%. This is why a relatively poor country like Russia can develop such a military machine, by taking money from healthcare and giving it to tanks. And Russian citizens are suffering from it, and the Russian economy is suffering from it. And conquering Ukraine will not make Russia prosperous. It will only make it even poorer. But Putin doesn't seem to care about it. He doesn't care about the welfare, certainly not of the Ukrainians, but not even of the Russians. And this is again why it's very important that he loses, and that countries around the world realize this is not the way to develop. If you want to become a powerful nation, a respected nation, you should invest in the education and healthcare of your citizens, so they became more educated, they build, high-tech industries and things like that. You don't invest in tanks to become a great nation.
In academic circles and in think tanks, there is a debate raging about whether the West forced Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. And this argument is led by Professor John Mearsheimer, the classical international affairs theorist who propounds the balance of power theory. And he says that after promising Gorbachev that they would not expand NATO eastwards, by constantly doing so and threatening to also include Ukraine in the EU and possibly also in the NATO alliance, because of the institutional history of the Russian Empire and because Putin sees himself as the new Tsar, the West has literally forced Putin's hand. Do you buy this argument, Professor Mearsheimer?
When you see the bombs falling on Kyiv, you can't accept this kind of argument. Nobody put a gun to Putin's head and said, you must invade Ukraine. It was his decision. And it should be very clear, NATO and the EU do not expand by force. How does the EU grow? It doesn't grow by sending tanks to force a country to join it. Countries join the EU and countries join NATO because they want to, out of their own free will. And why do they want to join NATO and the EU? Because they want a better future for their citizens and also because they are afraid of Russia. And can you blame them for being afraid of Russia? Can you blame, now that you see what's happening in Kyiv, can you blame Poland? Can you blame Estonia of wanting to be part of NATO? Yes, Russia has security concerns. But the way to discuss them is not by invading a weaker country. There was nothing urgent that forced Putin to invade now. It's not like people were actually discussing or about to accept Ukraine to NATO. It was not on the table. It's not like there was a German army massing on the borders about to invade. Nothing like it. Who wants to invade Russia? The last time somebody invaded Russia was Hitler 80 years ago, and nobody wants to repeat it. Do you think the Germans want to invade Russia? It's the last thing on their mind. Do you think Napoleon will come out of his grave and lead the French army to Moscow? This is ridiculous. You know, listening to these arguments about Russian defense interests, it's like seeing a person standing with his boot on the face of somebody and telling you, oh, please understand my security concerns. No. When you're standing with your boot on somebody's face, this is not the time to listen to your fears and to your concerns. Take your boot off his face, then we can listen to you.
No, but in a historical context, this is an interesting debate, because on the one side, there is the view that you're putting forward about this new peace, which you think isn't a statistical fluke or a hippie fantasy. On the other side, the likes of John Mearsheimer says that a lot of what you, Barack Obama and the others have been saying is just a fluke of history, that ultimately it reverts to the medium. Balance of power is what it's about, and if nations get together to threaten a great empire, the empire will strike back. It's just the way human nature has been for hundreds of years, and therefore just this period of relative peace after the Second World War doesn't take away from the larger historical context.
You know, when you say that war is natural, you are excusing criminals, because then it's not their fault. It's not Putin's fault that there is a war, it's the fault of human nature. And this is unacceptable. Humans have proven that they are able to make better decisions. The period of peace that we saw, not just in Europe, but in most of the world, in recent generations, was not a fantasy, it was real. And this is why I started with budgets, not with poems. Look in the budgets, and you will see how real the peace was. And if we now accept war as just natural, it means that military budgets all over the world will again skyrocket, and people will say, well, what do you want? War is part of human nature, so we have to prepare for it. And this is not true. There were periods of peace in history. There are periods of war in history. Yes, war is a possibility, but it is not an inevitability. Ultimately, war is decided upon by humans. It doesn't come from the laws of nature. And I'm afraid that scholars that try to present war as natural, they are excusing the criminals who start wars, and they also make it more likely that wars will happen, because if you think it's natural, then you double your military budget. And then your neighbors become afraid, they double their military budgets. And then you triple your budget, and they triple your budget. And this is a race to the bottom. And you know, previously in history, wars were destructive, but they couldn't destroy humanity. Now, with nuclear weapons, and with more and more new weapons coming from areas like artificial intelligence, if war is really part of human nature, then we are doomed. Then in a couple of decades, there will not be any human beings left. You know, previous conquerors in history, Genghis Khan, or the Mughals, or people like that, they could kill millions. They couldn't destroy humanity. With the technology of the 21st century, if we don't find a way to end war, then war will end us. We will not survive this century if we don't find a way to overcome war.
You seem to be suggesting that it's almost inevitable that nations that don't have nuclear weapons will now scurry around trying to see if they can get them. Ukraine had one of the world's largest arsenals of nuclear weapons, which after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine voluntarily gave away because there was a security pact between Russia, America and the NATO alliance that they would protect Ukraine. That didn't happen. Given Ukraine's plight, is it inevitable that more countries will scramble to get their hands on nukes?
It's not inevitable. It depends on what happens in the next few days and weeks and months. If Putin stops the war, or if Putin loses, then countries all over the world will learn the lesson that violence doesn't pay, and that it's better to go on investing our money in education and welfare and not in tanks and nukes. But if Putin succeeds and Ukraine is destroyed, then, as I said previously, more and more countries, Germany, Japan, Iran, and maybe later on Brazil, Saudi Arabia, more and more countries will say, hey, we also must have nukes. Otherwise, the same thing that happened to Ukraine will happen to us. And this is the road to hell. And we need to go in a different direction, and we need to do it now.
Let's spend a moment reflecting on the response of the world powers. The United States, countries in the European Union which seem more galvanized than before, and their response to President Putin. They're trying to give humanitarian aid, military supplies. Is there a fear in your mind that some of this could potentially cross President Putin's red lines and lead to an escalation?
I can't read President Putin's mind, especially because we've seen recently that he can harbor all kinds of fantasies and lies which have no connection with reality. So it is an extremely dangerous situation. But we can hope that the world powers will speak and also act in a way that will stop this war and will prevent Putin from winning. And because the fate of the whole of humanity is at stake, it's not just the responsibility of the EU or of the US to do something. All countries, including my country of Israel, including India. India is a very important country in this respect, not only because of its ties with Russia and because of its economic power, it's also, it sees itself as a spiritual leader of the world, as a world guru. And this is the time that we expect, you know, when you see a crime, you want to hear from spiritual leaders about it. I know that it is difficult in terms of Indian interests, but this is why there is a difference between interests and morality. Sometimes you need to do the right thing, even if it's not in your cold, calculated interest to do it. This is the meaning of morality. Otherwise, it's just interests. And you know, if your friend kills somebody and you don't say anything, what does it mean about you?
But that's something which can be said, Professor Harari, about Israel in particular on many occasions in terms of morality and interest. Yes, Israel always puts interest before morality.
I say it also about my government. I'm very disappointed to a large extent. You know, Jews go around the world telling people, wrongfully, but telling people that we invented morality and we have been spreading morality around the world for 2,000 years and the Bible and all that. But then when it comes to an actual real crisis, they think only about the interests. Israel is very, very careful not to say anything or do anything. You know, the EU blocked flights from Russia, but Israel didn't. So again, I don't expect Israel to send armed forces or weapons to Ukraine. but it can still do a lot. It can still at least voice its opposition to the war. You know, Putin justifies this war by saying that he aims to denazify Ukraine, as if Ukraine is ruled by Nazis. Now, the president of Ukraine is Jewish. Israel should be at the forefront of saying Putin is either a liar or a mad person. How can you say that they are Nazis? It desecrates the memory of the Holocaust to say such things. And yes, I'm quite disappointed that my government is not taking a more forceful position, at least on this front.
Professor Harari, if you were to look back at your book, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and look at how you may need to revise it, is it too soon, given that it's just been a week since this invasion? Or do you see there are trends that are emerging, dots which you can join, which suggest that, you know, some of this, or even if it's 21 centuries for the 21 lessons for the 21st century, that it would require revision? And if so, could you explain how and why?
Well, my main thesis was that humanity now has the power to control plagues and wars and famine, which were the most important threats to humanity throughout history, and that it now needs to focus in attention on the new threats of artificial intelligence and climate change and so forth. I never said that wars or plagues became impossible. I just said that we now, for the first time in history, can control them. We have the tools to stop them, but we need to use the tools. If politicians don't use the tools correctly, then as we saw with the corona, with the COVID epidemic, for the first time in history, we had the scientific and technological ability to understand and stop the epidemic, but we didn't use them wisely. It's the same with this war. It's not inevitable. We now have the institutions, we now have the culture necessary to stop wars, but it doesn't mean that we always have the political wisdom to actually do it. Now, if again, wars and epidemics and so forth, in the end, because of human stupidity, if they again spread, then this means we have no chance of dealing with the new threats of artificial intelligence, of climate change. And this, as I said, could lead to the extinction of our species. So I can't predict the future, and I never try to predict the future. I just try to give different scenarios, hoping that humans will make wise decisions, but knowing that we should never underestimate human stupidity. It's one of the most powerful forces in history. And especially when it comes to war, there is a built-in imbalance there, because to have peace, you need a lot of wise people to cooperate. To have war, you just need one person, one leader, to act in a cruel and senseless way, and this is enough to start a war.
You spoke of stupidity. You also write of hatred being the ugliest of emotions. For oppressed nations, hatred being a hidden treasure. And you write about how nations are built on stories. So with the passing days, how do you see the story of Ukraine being rewritten, Professor Harari?
You know, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, many people around the world didn't know anything about Ukraine, didn't know anything about its history, about its people. Now almost everybody around the world knows that Ukraine is not just a very real nation, it's a very proud, a very brave nation fighting for its survival. And I think the images, the stories coming out of Ukraine kind of electrified the whole world and gave courage to the whole world. You see people fighting with their bare hands, trying to stop a tank. You see civilians sitting in front of a tank to prevent it from progressing. And this, I think, is what gave courage to the Europeans to impose sanctions, to the Americans to kick Russia out of SWIFT, and so forth and so on. So stories are extremely powerful. In the long run, they are more powerful than tanks.
What defines defeat for Putin? What defines victory for Putin? You write about how humanity is hurtling towards disaster and we're on the edge of the abyss. given the military superiority of the Russian army vis-a-vis the Ukrainian army, and given the fact that the NATO isn't coming militarily to Ukraine's alliance, how would you define victory, how would you define defeat, and how can Putin get a face saver that helps him get off this ramp?
Again, Putin's aim in the war, and this is now very clear, is really to destroy Ukraine, to destroy the Ukrainian nation, and to absorb Ukraine back into a new Russian empire. And I think that he just can't do it, because it's based on a lie that there is no Ukrainian nation, and that the Ukrainians won't resist. So in this sense, he has already lost. He will not be able to absorb Ukraine into Russia. Every day that passes only increases the hatred of the Ukrainians towards the Russians and ensures that they will not agree to be absorbed into Russia. I hope that he can stop the war, and if necessary, if he needs a face saver, so somebody may come, the Chinese would intervene, the Indians would intervene as mediators, and offer him a ladder to climb down from this high tree he climbed to, and offer him, some small victory, symbolic victory, so he can go around and say, hey, I didn't really want to destroy Ukraine. I only wanted this little thing, and now that I have it, I can stop the war. And I hope that it will end like this, and not with months and years of terrible slaughter, of millions of refugees, and of hatred that will persist for generations.
And finally, will Russia's invasion of Ukraine embolden China to make a bid for Taiwan militarily, or will it actually, given the swift sanctions, the economic pushback, will it actually lead Xi Jinping to realize the futility of trying to invade Taiwan?
Everybody is watching exactly for that. Not just China. All kinds of tyrants and dictators and regimes throughout the world are watching what is happening, and they are sitting on the fence. If Putin looks like winning, they will become emboldened. They will think, aha, you can do that now. You can now invade another country and conquer it and get away with it. And they will also do it. If, however, they see Putin fail, then they will learn the lesson, no, it's not a good idea. Let's continue in different ways. Let's not risk it. This is why this war is so important for the whole world. If aggression is allowed to triumph in Ukraine, we will see more and more aggression and misery and death all over the world.
Over the past half an hour, I felt as if I've been back in college listening to a history lesson, but this is live events as they play themselves out, and your ability to give a macro historical perspective is par excellence. And we deeply appreciate, Professor Harari, that you took out time. We realize that you've got requests coming in from media the world over in the hundreds, and therefore for you to choose to accept our invitation means a lot to us, and it's been fantastic to have you back with us on India Today once again.
Thank you very much, and I hope that peace will come soon.
Inshallah, and I hope that peace does come as soon as possible, God willing. Professor Yuval Noah Harari, for joining us today, live and exclusive from Tel Aviv in Israel. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you.